The galaxy stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of stars and swirling nebulae. Amid this cosmic sprawl lay the mining colony of Arendor 7, a desolate rock orbiting a dying sun. Its surface was scarred by centuries of exploitation, cracked earth, littered with rusting machinery, jagged cliffs that loomed like broken teeth against the dim light of its fading star. The air was thin, recycled through ancient filtration systems cobbled together from salvaged parts. It carried the metallic tang of desperation, mingling with the faint hum of distant drills burrowing into the planet's core. Kael Voss moved through the chaos like a shadow, his presence barely registering among the weary miners who trudged between their shifts. He wore a patchwork suit stitched together from scavenged materials, its fabric frayed but functional. His face bore the marks of survival, sharp cheekbones etched with exhaustion, eyes hardened by years of loss. Kael had once been something more than this ghost haunting the edges of civilization. Once he'd worn a uniform, led men into battle, believed in causes greater than himself. Now, all he had left were instincts honed razor-sharp by necessity, and a name whispered in hushed tones across the galaxy. Arendor 7 wasn't just another forgotten outpost. It was a prison disguised as a workplace. Humans here weren't people. They were resources, expendable units feeding the insatiable hunger of the Galactic Lords. These beings, towering creatures of crystalline flesh and predatory grace, ruled the galaxy not through diplomacy or innovation, but through sheer dominance. They saw themselves as apex predators, their superiority justified by millennia of conquest. To them, weaker species existed only to serve, or to entertain. And entertainment for the Lords often took the form of hunts. Kael knew this better than anyone. He'd spent years trapped in their arenas, forced to fight for survival while crowds of glittering aliens cheered for bloodshed. Each victory had come at a cost. Friends lost, pieces of himself chipped away until there was little left but rage and regret. When escape finally came, it hadn't felt like freedom. It felt like running, always one step ahead of the hunters, who would never stop pursuing him. But even shadows can't hide forever. The first sign of trouble came when the comm channels crackled to life with static-laced warnings. A young miner named Lira stumbled into Kael's makeshift shelter, her breath ragged, her hands trembling as she clutched a data drive. She spoke quickly, her voice barely above a whisper, explaining how she'd hacked into the Lord's secure network during routine maintenance. What she found chilled her to the bone, a list of coordinates, names, dates, evidence of atrocities committed under the guise of sport, entire colonies wiped out, their populations rounded up and shipped off to arenas scattered across the galaxy. They're coming here next, Lira said, her wide eyes locking onto Kael's. They've marked this colony for the hunt. For a moment, Kael didn't respond. He stared at the girl, seeing echoes of faces long gone. Soldiers, comrades, innocents caught in the crossfire of someone else's game. Then he shook his head, turning away. Not my problem, he muttered, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. Survival had taught him the value of detachment. Every time he reached out, every time he tried to help, it ended in ruin. Better to stay invisible, to let others deal with their own messes. Lira refused to give up. She stepped closer, her small frame radiating defiance despite the fear in her voice. You don't understand. This isn't just about us. If we broadcast what I found, if we show everyone what they're doing, maybe we can make them stop. Her conviction struck a nerve deep within Kael, stirring memories he'd buried long ago. Memories of standing shoulder to shoulder with others, fighting not just for survival but for something greater, for hope. But hope was dangerous. It burned bright and fast, leaving ashes in its wake. Still, he couldn't ignore the resolve in her gaze. There was fire there, raw and untamed, the kind that reminded him why he'd fought in the first place. Against his better judgment, Kael agreed to help. Together, they devised a plan to smuggle Lira off-world before the Lords arrived. Escape. Routes were mapped, supplies gathered, contingencies prepared. Yet no amount of planning could account for betrayal. As they made their way toward the hidden docking bay, alarms blared, piercing the oppressive silence. Searchlights swept across the barren landscape, illuminating figures clad in gleaming armor, enforcers sent by the Lords to ensure no one escaped their grasp. Chaos erupted. Miners scattered, some screaming, others frozen in terror. Kael grabbed Lira's arm, pulling her toward cover, but the enforcers were relentless. Their weapons spat bursts of energy, carving craters into the ground. One shot grazed Kael's shoulder, sending searing pain lancing through his body. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep moving. They reached the relative safety of an abandoned transport module, but it was too late. The enforcers surrounded them, their leader stepping forward, with a cruel smile twisting his crystalline features. "You've caused quite the disturbance," the enforcer said, his voice smooth and cold, like ice sliding over steel. "Hand over the girl and perhaps we'll let you live." Kael's mind raced, weighing options that dwindled with each passing second. Beside him, Lira trembled, clutching the data drive tightly. Her faith in him wavered, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. And then, with a sudden clarity born of desperation, Kael acted. He shoved Lira backward, shouting for her to run, and turned to face the enforcers alone. Shots rang out, explosions rocked the ground, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow. When the dust settled, Kael lay battered and bleeding, his vision swimming. The enforcers dragged Lira away, her cries echoing in his ears. Rage surged within him, hot and consuming, but beneath it lay a deeper emotion, one he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Guilt, failure, determination. As the enforcers departed, leaving behind only silence and destruction, Kael forced himself to stand. Pain screamed through every nerve, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the single thought burning in his mind. He wouldn't fail again. Not this time. The aftermath of the ambush lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Kael staggered through the wreckage of Arendor 7, his body battered but his resolve unbroken. Each step sent waves of agony coursing through him, yet he pressed on, driven by a singular purpose. Lira's capture wasn't just another loss. It was a catalyst, reigniting embers of defiance he thought had long since burned out. The data drive she carried held more than evidence. It represented humanity's last chance to fight back against the Galactic Lords' tyranny, but Kael knew better than to act alone. Survival had taught him the value of allies, even if trust came at a premium. He limped toward the rebel outpost, hidden in the shadow of Arendor 7's largest mining complex, a labyrinthine structure carved into the planet's crust. Its entrance was disguised as a collapsed tunnel, guarded by automated turrets and biometric scanners. Only those who knew the secret knock could gain access. Kael rapped his knuckles against the rusted metal door in a precise rhythm, then waited, his breath shallow, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The door creaked open, revealing Commander Sarah Vallis. She stood silhouetted against dim emergency lights, her figure lean and angular, her expression unreadable. Once a comrade in arms during Earth's final stand against the Lords, Sarah had become disillusioned after years of defeat. Her once bright idealism had been ground down into pragmatism, her belief in humanity's resilience replaced by cynicism. She regarded Kael with a mixture of surprise and suspicion, her sharp eyes scanning him for signs of injury or weakness. "You look like hell," she said finally, her voice low and measured. "What do you want?" Kael didn't waste time with pleasantries. He explained what had happened, Lira's discovery, the ambush, her capture, and outlined his plan to infiltrate the Lord's flagship arena. Sarah listened silently, her face betraying little emotion. When he finished, she let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You're talking about suicide," she said. "Even if we manage to get aboard their ship, there's no guarantee we'll make it out alive, and for what, one girl?" "It's not just about her," Kael shot back, his voice tight with frustration. "She has proof of what they've done, proof we can use to expose them, to rally others. If we don't try, we might as well hand ourselves over to them now. Sarah studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing. Then she sighed, stepping aside to allow him entry. Fine, but don't expect miracles. We're stretched thin as it is. Inside the outpost, the air was thick with tension. Rebels moved about in hurried silence, their faces gaunt, their movements efficient. The walls were lined with makeshift equipment, holographic maps displaying enemy positions, weapon racks stocked with scavenged firearms, and terminals buzzing with intercepted communications. At the center of it all sat Eris, a rogue AI housed within a portable server unit. Its interface glowed softly, casting an eerie light across the room. Eris greeted Kael with a synthetic voice, devoid of inflection. "You've returned. I assume. This means you require assistance." "I need everything you've got on their flagship," Kael replied, leaning heavily on a nearby table. "Layouts, security protocols, anything that'll give us an edge." Eris processed the request, its screen flickering as it accessed encrypted files. The Lord's vessels are designed to deter infiltration. Automated defenses, bioscanners, and neural inhibitors ensure compliance among prisoners. However, it paused as if considering its next words carefully. There may be vulnerabilities. Their arrogance often leads to oversight. While Eris compiled the data, Kael turned, his attention to Sarah, who was briefing a small team of rebels. They were a motley crew, former soldiers, engineers, and even a few miners eager to strike back. None of them trusted Kael completely, their skepticism evident in the way they avoided meeting his eyes. Still, they listened intently as he laid out the plan, a covert operation to smuggle themselves aboard the flagship disguised as prisoners, rescue Lira, and retrieve the data drive. As preparations continued, Kael found himself reflecting on the absurdity of it all. Here he was, rallying a ragtag group of misfits to take on beings who viewed humanity as little more than prey. The odds were laughably stacked against them, yet something about the situation felt right. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He was fighting back. The journey to the Lord's domain began aboard a stolen transport shuttle, its hull pockmarked with battle scars. The rebels huddled together in cramped quarters, their nerves taut as they approached the massive vessel looming ahead. The flagship was a monstrosity of engineering, its sleek design reminiscent of a predator poised to strike. Jagged spires jutted from its surface, glowing faintly with energy fields that pulsed like veins beneath translucent skin. Docking procedures were tense. Eris manipulated the shuttle's systems to mimic a prisoner transfer, feeding false credentials into the Lord's network. Alarms blared intermittently, each passing second stretching into eternity. Finally, the docking clamps engaged, securing the shuttle in place. The rebels disembarked cautiously, their disguises holding up under scrutiny. For now. Inside the flagship, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The corridors were vast and sterile, illuminated by cold blue light that cast long shadows. Guards patrolled in pairs, their crystalline forms shimmering ominously. The rebels moved quickly, sticking to predetermined routes while avoiding detection. Kael led the way, his senses attuned to every sound, every movement. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of intel provided by Eris. He knew where Lira was being held, the central arena, a coliseum designed for spectacle and slaughter. But reaching her would require navigating a maze of traps and patrols. There, progress was halted abruptly when they encountered a patrol rounding a corner. Panic surged, but Kael reacted instinctively, shoving one of the rebels into a nearby alcove. The others followed suit, pressing themselves flat against the wall as the guards passed by without noticing. Breathing shallowly, Kael signaled for the group to continue, his heart pounding in his chest. Further along, they reached a checkpoint manned by a lone guard. This time, stealth wasn't an option. Kael stepped forward, feigning compliance until he was close enough to strike. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the guard and subdued him, ensuring the creature remained unconscious rather than dead. The act drew uneasy glances from the rebels. some of whom whispered about the morality of sparing an enemy. Kael ignored them, focusing instead on the task at hand. Finally, they arrived at the entrance to the arena. Massive doors loomed before them, adorned with intricate carvings depicting scenes of conquest and domination. Beyond lay Lira and the truth she carried. But as Kael prepared to breach the doors, a chilling realization struck him. The Lords weren't just hunting for sport. They believed themselves gods shaping the galaxy according to their will. To them, humanity's extinction was inevitable, a natural order they were merely hastening. This revelation weighed heavily on Kael as he pushed forward, leading the rebels into the belly of the beast. The arena awaited, its sands soaked with the blood of countless victims. And somewhere within, Lira fought to survive, unaware that salvation, or doom, was closing in. The arena was a nightmare made manifest. Its cavernous expanse stretched endlessly, surrounded by towering walls of translucent alloy that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Above, the Lord's elite spectators lounged in opulent viewing pods, their crystalline forms casting prismatic reflections across the sands below. The air was thick with anticipation, the hum of energy fields mingling with the low murmur of alien voices discussing odds and outcomes. It was a place where life held no value beyond entertainment, a theater of death designed to glorify the hunters and degrade the hunted. Kael and his team slipped into the shadows beneath the stands, their movements cautious but deliberate. Every step echoed faintly against the metallic floor, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence of the space. They had reached the heart of the beast, but survival depended on precision. One wrong move, one misstep, and they would be exposed. Kael's mind raced as he scanned the layout provided by Eris, searching for any sign of Lira. She was somewhere within this labyrinth, her fate hanging precariously in the balance. The rebels split into two groups, Sarah leading a contingent to disable key security systems while Kael pressed forward toward the central holding cells. Each decision carried weight, every choice fraught with risk. As they moved deeper into the ship, the tension grew palpable. The corridors were eerily quiet, save for the occasional whir of automated drones patrolling overhead. Their glowing eyes swept back and forth, scanning for anomalies. Kael kept his head down, his pulse hammering in his ears as he avoided detection. It wasn't long before complications arose. In a narrow passageway lined with pulsating conduits, the group encountered a patrol larger than anticipated. There was no time to retreat. The guards spotted them almost immediately. Chaos erupted as blaster fire ricocheted off the walls, lighting up the dim corridor with bursts of searing light. Kael dove for cover behind a stack of crates, returning fire with grim efficiency. His aim was true, taking down two of the guards before their reinforcements arrived. "Fall back," Sarah shouted over the din, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "We can't hold this position." Reluctantly, Kael signaled for the others to retreat, falling back into a maintenance tunnel that branched off from the main corridor. The narrow passage offered temporary refuge, but it also trapped them. Behind them, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed ominously. Ahead lay only darkness, the path uncharted and uncertain. As they regrouped, tempers flared. One of the rebels, a burly engineer named Jarek, turned on Kael, his face flushed with anger. "This was supposed to be a stealth mission. You said you knew what you were doing." "And I do," Kael snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut steel. "But plans change when reality hits. We adapt, or we die." Jarek opened his mouth to argue further, but Sarah intervened, stepping between them with a glare that silenced both men. "Enough. Arguing won't get us out of here. Focus on the objective." Her words brought a semblance of calm, though the underlying tension remained. Kael took a deep breath, forcing himself to push aside the frustration boiling inside him. He couldn't afford distractions, not now, not when so much was at stake. Turning to Eris, who had been monitoring their progress remotely, he asked for an alternate route to the holding cells. "There is another way," the AI replied, its synthetic voice devoid of emotion. "However, it requires traversing a restricted zone controlled by neural inhibitors. Exposure may cause disorientation and memory loss. Kael hesitated, weighing the risks. Time was running out, and every second spent deliberating brought them closer to failure. Finally, he nodded. "We don't have a choice. Lead the way." The restricted zone proved to be even more treacherous than anticipated. The air crackled, with static electricity, and faint pulses of energy rippled along the walls, distorting perception. Colors shifted unpredictably, sounds warped and distorted, and the very fabric of reality seemed to bend under the influence of the inhibitors. Rebels stumbled, clutching their heads as waves of dizziness washed over them. Some collapsed entirely, overwhelmed by the assault on their senses. Kael gritted his teeth, fighting through the disorienting effects. His vision blurred, memories flickering like fragmented images, faces of comrades lost, battles fought, promises broken. For a moment he faltered, the weight of his past threatening to pull him under. But then he remembered Lira's determination, her unwavering faith in humanity's potential. That thought anchored him, steadying his resolve. He pressed onward, dragging those who had fallen until they could stand again. When they finally emerged from the restricted zone, the relief was short-lived. A traitor revealed themselves among the group, a young miner named Tessa, whose fear had driven her to desperation. With tears streaming down her face, she confessed that she had contacted the Lords, offering information in exchange for leniency. Her betrayal left the rebels reeling, their trust shattered. "You idiot," Sarah hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "Do you realize what you've done?" Tessa crumpled to the ground, sobbing. "I didn't think. I just wanted to live." Kael stared at her, a storm of emotions raging within him. Part of him wanted to lash out, to punish her for jeopardizing everything. But another part understood her fear, the instinctual drive to survive at any cost. Instead of acting on impulse, he knelt beside her, his voice low but firm. "You've made your choice. Now you'll have to live with the consequences, but if you want redemption, help us finish this." Tessa nodded weakly, her resolve hardening as she wiped away her tears. Whether it was genuine remorse or sheer terror driving her, Kael couldn't say. What mattered was that she chose to fight alongside them rather than against them, with renewed urgency. The group pushed forward, reaching the holding cells at last. The area was heavily guarded, but Eris managed to hack into the system, disabling the locks temporarily. Inside they found Lira huddled in a corner, her face pale but defiant. When she saw Kael, relief flooded her features, followed quickly by anger. "I told you to run," she said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you leave me?" "Because I gave you my word," Kael replied simply, "and because humanity doesn't abandon its own." The reunion was brief. Alarms began blaring moments later, signaling that their presence had been detected. Reinforcements poured into the corridor, forcing the rebels to fight their way out. Blaster bolts lit up the air, explosions rocked the walls, and the scent of scorched metal filled the atmosphere. Despite the chaos, Kael remained focused, his instincts guiding him through the fray. He shielded Lira with his body, ensuring she stayed safe even as the battle raged around them. Amid the carnage, a revelation struck Kael, one that shook him to his core. As he engaged a particularly formidable guard, he noticed something etched into the creature's armor, a symbol identical to the one carved into the arena doors. It was a sigil representing the Lord's belief in natural selection, a philosophy rooted in domination and superiority. But as Kael studied it, he realized the truth. The Lords weren't merely predators. They were architects, shaping the galaxy according to their vision of order. To them, humanity's extinction wasn't cruelty, it was inevitability. This understanding gnawed at him, challenging everything he thought he knew about the enemy. Were they truly monsters, or were they simply playing their role in a cosmic hierarchy? Could such beliefs ever justify the atrocities they committed? The questions swirled in his mind, unresolved but impossible to ignore. By the time they reached the rendezvous point, casualties had mounted. Several rebels lay dead or wounded, their sacrifices etched into Kael's conscience. Yet despite the losses, there was a glimmer of hope. Lira still clutched the data drive, its contents intact. And though the odds remained daunting, the rebels had proven their resilience, their ability to adapt and endure. As they prepared for the final push toward escape, Kael allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of all those who had fallen, not just today but throughout the years of resistance. Their struggles, their pain, their hopes, all of it had led to this moment. Humanity's ingenuity, its capacity to rise above despair, was its greatest strength, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough to turn the tide. The flagship loomed above them, its spires gleaming like jagged teeth. Beyond its walls lay freedom or annihilation. Either way, Kael was ready. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, carrying the weight of humanity's defiance with him every step of the way. The escape route was a gauntlet of fire and fury. The flagship's corridors had transformed into a war zone, the once pristine halls now scorched and littered with debris. Alarms screamed incessantly, their shrill tones reverberating through the ship like the cries of a dying beast. Kael led the charge, his every step fueled by adrenaline and desperation. Behind him, the remnants of the rebel team moved as one, a fractured but determined unit clinging to the fragile hope that they could still win this fight. But winning wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about striking back, about proving to the Galactic Lords, and to themselves, that humanity wasn't merely prey. They were hunters, too. As they neared the docking bay where their stolen shuttle awaited, a massive blast shook the ship, throwing everyone off balance. The explosion came from deeper within the vessel, likely triggered by Sarah's sabotage efforts to buy them time. For a fleeting moment, Kael allowed himself to feel a flicker of pride in her ingenuity. Then reality snapped back into focus. The blast had also alerted the Lord's elite forces who descended upon them with terrifying speed. The first wave hit hard. Crystalline warriors emerged from the smoke, their forms shimmering like liquid light. Each movement was precise, each strike calculated to incapacitate or kill. Kael met them head-on, his weapon blazing as he carved a path through the chaos. His body screamed in protest, muscles burning from exertion, wounds reopening under the strain. Yet he didn't falter. Every shot fired, every blow landed, carried the weight of years of rage and regret. This was his reckoning. Lira stayed close, clutching the data drive as if it were a lifeline. Her presence grounded him, reminding him why he fought. She wasn't just a symbol of resistance. She was proof that humanity could endure, adapt, and rise above despair. Around them, the rebels fought valiantly, their numbers dwindling, but their resolve unbroken. Some fell, their sacrifices buying precious seconds for the rest to advance. Others pressed forward, driven by sheer willpower. Amid the carnage, Eris's voice crackled over their comms, calm and detached despite the chaos unfolding around them. Primary objective achieved. Security systems are destabilized. However, Lord Xynar approaches. Kael froze mid-step, the name sending a chill down his spine. Xynar, the most ruthless of the Galactic Lords, the architect of countless hunts and massacres. He was the embodiment of everything Kael despised, the face of humanity's oppression. And now, he was coming for them personally. "Stay focused," Kael barked, though his own heart pounded wildly. "We finish this together." They reached the docking bay, only to find it swarming with enforcers. The stolen shuttle sat tantalizingly close, its engines humming softly as if mocking their predicament. Escape seemed impossible, yet surrender was unthinkable. Kael exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded grimly. There was no need for words. They both understood what had to be done. Splitting the group, Kael led a diversionary assault while Sarah and Lira made a break for the shuttle. Blaster fire erupted in all directions, filling the air with searing heat and acrid smoke. Kael fought like a man possessed, his movements a blur of ferocity and precision. He took down enemies with brutal efficiency, his mind shutting out everything except the next target, the next obstacle between him and victory. And then, Lord Xynar appeared. He strode into the fray like a storm made flesh, his crystalline form, towering over the battlefield. Energy crackled around him, an aura of power that sent even his own soldiers retreating instinctively. His eyes, cold, calculating, devoid of mercy, locked onto Kael. A cruel smile twisted his features as he raised a hand, summoning a weapon forged from pure energy. "So," Xynar said, his voice resonating like thunder, "you are the one who has caused so much trouble." How quaint. Kael didn't respond. Words were meaningless here. Instead, he charged, unleashing every ounce of anger and determination he possessed. Their clash was cataclysmic, a collision of raw strength and unyielding will. Xynar's attacks were devastating, each strike capable of shattering steel, but Kael countered with cunning and grit, exploiting every opening, refusing to yield even as blood streamed from fresh wounds. Around them, the battle raged on. Rebels continued to hold the line, buying time for Sarah and Lira to reach the shuttle. Explosions rocked the docking bay, sending chunks of metal raining down like meteors. Through the chaos, Kael caught glimpses of his allies falling, their sacrifices etched into his soul. Each loss fueled his resolve, driving him to push harder, fight smarter. At one point, Xynar paused, tilting his head as if amused by Kael's tenacity. "You humans are fascinating creatures," he mused, his tone almost admiring. "So fragile, yet so stubborn. Do you truly believe your defiance matters? Your species is destined for extinction, a footnote in the annals of galactic history." Kael spat blood from his mouth, glaring at the Lord with unbridled hatred. "Maybe we're destined to die, but we'll take you bastards down with us." Xynar chuckled, the sound chilling in its indifference. Such passion, such futility. Their duel resumed, escalating to a crescendo of violence and destruction. Kael knew he couldn't match Xynar's raw power, so he relied on strategy and improvisation. Using the environment to his advantage, he lured the Lord into precarious positions, forcing him to expend energy countering traps and hazards. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation bred ingenuity. Finally, an opportunity presented itself. As Xynar unleashed a devastating attack, Kael feinted left, drawing the Lord's attention before darting right. With a roar of defiance, he hurled a makeshift explosive, a fragment of shattered conduit rigged with volatile chemicals, at Xynar's feet. The blast engulfed the area in blinding light and deafening noise, sending both combatants sprawling. When the dust settled, Kael staggered to his feet, battered but alive. Across from him, Xynar rose as well, his crystalline form cracked and dimmed. For the first time, there was uncertainty in his gaze, a flicker of doubt that Kael seized upon. "You underestimated us," Kael growled, advancing despite the agony coursing through his body. "That's your mistake." With a final, primal scream, Kael launched himself at Xynar, driving them both toward the edge of the docking bay. The impact sent them tumbling over the railing, plummeting toward the abyss below. Xynar struggled to regain control, but Kael held fast, ensuring neither of them would escape. Together, they crashed into the lower levels of the flagship, the impact triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. Above, the remaining rebels boarded the shuttle, Sarah shouting orders as alarms blared louder than ever. Lira clutched the data drive tightly, tears streaming down her face as she watched the inferno consuming the ship. "We have to go," Sarah urged, dragging her toward the cockpit. "No," Lira cried, resisting. "We can't leave him." "He gave us a chance," Sarah replied, her voice firm but tinged with sorrow. "Don't waste it." Reluctantly, Lira obeyed, collapsing into a seat as the shuttle disengaged from the flagship. Behind them, the vessel began to collapse, its internal systems failing under the strain of multiple breaches. Fire consumed its core, lighting up the void like a dying star. Inside the wreckage, Kael lay broken but conscious, his vision fading as darkness crept in. Xynar was nearby, his once mighty form reduced to shards of fractured crystal. Though victorious, Kael felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a profound sense of loss. Faces of those who had fallen flashed before his eyes, their voices whispering words of gratitude and farewell. Then, amidst the ruin, a faint transmission reached him. It was Eris, her synthetic voice steady despite the interference. Mission. Parameters fulfilled. Humanity endures. Your legacy will inspire others. Kael managed a weak smile, his lips curling upward despite the pain. Good. As the flagship imploded, taking the remnants of the Galactic Lords' dominance with it, Kael closed his eyes, allowing the silence to envelop him. He had fought, not just for revenge, but for something greater. For hope. For resilience, for the belief that humanity could rise above even the darkest of times. And in that moment, he found peace. The shuttle hurtled through the void, its engines straining, against the gravitational pull of the collapsing flagship. Inside, the surviving rebels sat in stunned silence, their bodies battered and their minds reeling from the events that had unfolded. The air was thick with grief and exhaustion, but beneath it all simmered a fragile sense of triumph. They had survived. Against all odds, they had struck a blow against the Galactic Lords, a blow that would echo across the galaxy. Lira clutched the data drive tightly to her chest, her knuckles white with tension. Her eyes were red-rimmed, tears still, streaming down her face as she stared out the viewport at the fiery inferno consuming the flagship. She wanted to believe Kael was alive, that somehow he had escaped the destruction. But deep down she knew the truth. His sacrifice had bought them this chance, this fleeting moment of freedom. And now, it was up to her, and the rest of humanity, to honor it. Sarah stood at the helm, her hands gripping the controls with a steadiness that belied the turmoil within her. For years she had doubted humanity's ability to fight back, convinced that resistance was futile in the face of such overwhelming power. But Kael had proven her wrong. He hadn't just fought. He had inspired. His actions had reignited something in her, a spark of hope she thought long extinguished. As the flagship disappeared into the void, leaving behind only a faint glow of embers, Sarah whispered a silent vow. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The rebels regrouped on a remote outpost orbiting a distant moon, a hidden sanctuary, for those who refused to bow to the Lord's tyranny. Word of their victory spread quickly, carried by encrypted transmissions and whispered rumors. Across the galaxy, colonies that had once lived in fear began to stir. The fall of Xynar, one of the most feared lords, sent shockwaves through the hierarchy of the Galactic Empire. For the first time in centuries, there was doubt, a crack in the facade of invincibility that the lords had so carefully constructed. But victory came at a cost. The faces of the fallen haunted every survivor, their sacrifices etched into memory, like scars that would never fully heal. Jarek, Tessa, and countless others had given their lives to ensure the mission's success. Their names were spoken softly during makeshift memorials held in dimly lit chambers, their stories shared as a reminder of what had been lost, and what remained to be gained. As days turned into weeks, the rebels worked tirelessly to disseminate the evidence Lira had risked everything to retrieve. The data drive contained more than just records of atrocities. It revealed the inner workings of the Lord's empire, exposing vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Holographic projections displayed maps of key installations, schematics of advanced weaponry, and intercepted communications detailing internal dissent among the Lords themselves. Humanity now had a blueprint, not just for survival but for rebellion. Yet the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. The collapse of the flagship had created a power vacuum, leaving factions within the Lord's empire vying for control. Some advocated for continued domination, while others pushed for retreat and consolidation. Meanwhile, human colonies faced new challenges as they emerged from hiding. Resources were scarce, alliances fragile, and trust hard-earned. The question loomed large. What kind of future did humanity want to build? Would they rise united or fracture under the weight of their own divisions? Kael's legacy became a rallying cry, his name whispered in reverence by those who dared to dream of a better tomorrow. Stories of his defiance spread like wildfire, painting him not as a lone hero but as a symbol of collective resilience. Artisans crafted murals depicting his final stand against Xynar, capturing the raw emotion of his sacrifice. Poets penned verses celebrating his courage, weaving his tale into the fabric of human culture. To some, he was a martyr. To others, a legend. But to all, he was proof that even in the darkest of times, humanity could find light. For Lira, the burden of carrying Kael's torch weighed heavily. She spent hours poring over the data drive, deciphering its contents and strategizing how best to use them. Yet she also found solace in the connections she forged with the other survivors. Together they formed a council, pooling their skills and knowledge to chart a course forward. Engineers worked alongside philosophers, soldiers collaborated with diplomats, and even Eris, the rogue AI, played a crucial role, offering insights that transcended human limitations. One evening, as the Outpost's artificial sun dipped below, the horizon casting long shadows across the barren landscape, Lira stood alone on an observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly before her, each pinprick of light a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the potential within humanity to explore it. She thought of Kael, of the fire in his eyes when he spoke of hope, of defiance, of the belief that humanity's greatest strength lay not in its weapons or technology, but in its capacity to adapt, to endure, to rise above despair. A voice broke the silence. It was Syrah, her presence steady and reassuring. "He believed in us," she said simply, joining Lira at the railing. "And because of that, we have a chance." Lira nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We'll make sure his sacrifice means something. We'll rebuild, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who came before us. For everyone who will come after." Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of solidarity. "Then let's get to work." Years passed, and the galaxy changed. The fall of the Flagship marked the beginning of a new era, an era defined not by oppression but by resistance. Human colonies flourished once more, their populations swelling with refugees eager to reclaim their freedom. Cities rose from the ashes of old ruins, their skylines adorned with symbols of defiance, banners bearing Kael's likeness, monuments inscribed with his words, and ships named in his honor. But peace was elusive. The remnants of the Galactic Lords regrouped, retreating to the fringes of known space where they plotted their return. Rumors spread of a mysterious figure leading their resurgence, a being who claimed to understand humanity's greatest weakness, its capacity for division. Whispers spoke of experiments, of attempts to weaponize the very traits that made humans unique. Fear lingered, a shadow cast over the fragile hope that had taken root. On a distant planet shrouded in perpetual twilight, a young scavenger stumbled upon something strange buried beneath the sands. It was a crystalline shard, pulsating faintly with an otherworldly energy. The boy reached for it hesitantly, unaware that his discovery would set into motion events that could alter the course of history. Far away, aboard a rebel vessel, navigating uncharted territories, Lira gazed at the stars through a viewport. Beside her, holographic displays flickered with reports of renewed activity along the borders of former Lord-controlled space. Her expression hardened, resolve burning in her eyes. "They're coming back," she murmured, her voice steady, despite the weight of the revelation. "And when they do, we'll be ready." Behind her, Eris chimed in, its synthetic tones tinged with curiosity. "Perhaps readiness is not enough. Perhaps adaptation is required." Lira turned to face the AI, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then let's adapt, together." As the ship sailed onward, its destination unknown, the promise of humanity's future hung suspended in the balance, a beacon of hope amid the endless expanse of stars.